There's a part of me as a millennial that sometimes genuinely struggles to understand my own generation. The brunches, the pugs, the chinos, the avocado toast, none of that ever felt like my reality. I never built a personality around coffee shops, quirky consumer habits, or whatever internet culture decided millennials were supposed to represent. So when I started researching this video and came across article after article listing millennial traits, I felt disconnected from almost everything in them. One list even named avocado toast as a defining millennial trait. I remember the trend, but I always tied it more to Gen X wellness than my peers. Maybe that's anecdotal, but I never saw millennials organize their identities around bread and avocados. Yet it somehow became the symbol of an entire generation. This is why the conversation about generational identity often feels shallow. It defaults to stereotypes rather than confronting the deeper structural factors that truly shape generational experiences and tensions. When I started reading these Gen Z versus Millennials articles, I expected actual critiques. In fact, I welcomed them. I don't think anyone is above criticism. Not me, not my generation. I wanted the challenge, so to speak. I expected conversations about economics, politics, work, technology, or the psychological effects of growing up in each era. Instead, most articles focused on superficial trends: skinny jeans, side parts, Harry Potter references, disposable internet observations that collapse under scrutiny. And yeah, sure, some millennial behaviors cringe. I mean, every generation has its embarrassing habits, aesthetics, and cultural blind spots. Gen Z has them. Gen Alpha will most definitely have them. That's normal. Young people experiment with identity, culture, language, and trends. They always have. That's part of growing up. The specifics change, but the process never really does. What bothers me, however, is that these discussions rarely move beyond surface traits to the structural realities that actually drive generational tension and conflict. Millennial resentment, for example, toward boomers wasn't about cultural quirks or outdated aesthetics. We weren't angry about disco or vinyl nostalgia. The frustration was watching boomers control institutions, accumulate wealth, crash the economy time and time again, and then lecture us about hard work as opportunities shrink. That was the real conflict. And that's what makes some of the criticism aimed at millennials feel so strange. Millennials are nowhere near the position boomers occupied when millennials were coming of age. We don't meaningfully control the institutions that shape society. Millennials make up only a small share of Congress and remain underrepresented in elected office relative to our share of the population. Even within the federal workforce, millennials are far from the dominant force many imagine. In other words, millennials don't yet possess the political, economic, or institutional power to shape broad outcomes for younger generations. This creates an awkward problem for those framing millennials as the new boomers. If we don't control the system, criticism of our political behavior becomes harder. What's left, however, is culture, skinny jeans, side parts, avocado toast, Harry Potter. By contrast, the millennial critique of boomers was rooted in material conditions. It was about unaffordable housing, stagnant wages, exploiting tuition, employment-tied healthcare, and growing wealth concentration. The latter was pulled up while those below jumped, fighting for something stable to hold on to. I mean, imagine if millennials had looked at all of that and decided the real issue with boomers was their obsession with 8-tracks and classic rock nostalgia. That would have been absurd. But that's what parts of this current generational discourse feel like now. Entire conversations about social collapse are reduced to whether somebody parts their hair wrong or uses outdated emojis. And I think part of the reason this disconnect exists is that millennials themselves now occupy a strange historical place. We're not the future anymore. We're no longer the young generation that everybody projects their hopes and anxieties onto either. Society has shifted its attention toward Gen Z and Gen Alpha the same way it once fixated on us. Millennials are becoming the middle layer, old enough to feel exhausted, but not old enough to feel secure. We're kind of like Gen X without the money, honestly. And further, millennials didn't age normally. The recession delayed adulthood, careers, homeownership, marriage, and stability all stalled. The pandemic distorted time further. Now we age biologically while feeling stuck in survival mode. That changes people. Some millennials became cynical. Some detached entirely. Some finally achieved a small measure of stability and became protective of it, having spent most of their adult lives without a real safety net beneath them. And while I don't think that excuses selfishness or political apathy, I do think it helps explain part of the psychology behind them. Because when people spend decades surviving precarity, survival itself starts becoming their worldview. Meanwhile, Gen Z inherited a very different reality from millennials. While millennials viewed societal collapse as an interruption to a once promising future and held onto the idea that patience and hard work would eventually pay off, Gen Z came of age with no such assurances. For Gen Z, economic opportunity felt inaccessible from the start. Higher education seemed synonymous with debt, home ownership appeared impossible, and social relationships were filtered from the beginning through apps that exploit insecurity and outrage. The difference lies in the promise of stability for millennials versus the absence of that promise for Gen Z. However, this difference in formative experience helps explain why irony and detachment are so prominent in Gen Z culture in contrast to millennials' earlier optimism. While millennials remember a version of society where stability was at least promised, Gen Z only know the aftermath, growing up as institutions faltered and the illusion of stability vanished. This creates a fundamentally different psychology. Millennials remember renting movies. We remember visiting malls and being online with a clear boundary between real and digital selves. For Gen Z, that line was already blurred. Gen Z rarely experienced that divide between online and offline identities, and for Gen Alpha, the boundary is even more blurred. Where millennials once treated an online persona as an extension for younger generations, Gen Z rarely experienced that divide between online and offline identities, and for Gen Alpha, the boundary is even more blurred. Where millennials once treated an online persona as an extension for younger generations, it's often the main identity. This difference in digital life between millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha marks a significant generational shift. Their social lives developed alongside algorithms that shaped behavior, rewarded visibility, flattened identity into performance, and encouraged people to package themselves for consumption. With this childhood environment, performance eventually stops feeling fake. It's woven into social survival. Millennials were probably the beta test for all this. We curated ourselves online too. MySpace pages, Facebook profiles, Tumblr, but there was still a separation between the performance and your actual life because eventually you logged off. For Gen Z and especially Gen Alpha, that separation barely exists anymore. Modern discourse feels hollow. People talk constantly but seem disconnected from anything solid. Trends move too fast to process. Identities form around shifting aesthetics and subcultures, providing structure in an unstable world. And honestly, I think older generations misread a lot of this as narcissism when a lot of it is actually just adaptation. If every social platform trains you to treat yourself like a public-facing product from the age of 12, eventually you stop knowing where your actual personality ends and the performance begins. So when millennials and Gen Z fight online, it isn't just about each other. Millennials' conflicts are shaped by expectations of lost security, while Gen Z's are influenced by having never seen that security as possible. Their arguments are really about the different psychological scars created by the same collapsing system. Now, both generations see each other through distorted lenses. Millennials see in Gen Z apathy, irony, and detachment, recycled aesthetics, and performative politics. Gen Z looks at millennials and sees burnout, contradiction, fake optimism, and a generation that once talked about changing the world but now seems too exhausted to keep trying. Both sides are partially right. But while everybody argues about aesthetics and generational stereotypes, the system that created most of this frustration continue operating untouched. Housing is still unaffordable, healthcare is still broken. Wealth inequality is still growing. People are still isolated, overworked, financially insecure, and emotionally exhausted. That's why the discourse feels so fucking empty. It mistakes symptoms for causes. By focusing on aesthetics, we turn generational frustration into tribalism and lose sight of the structural issues, like unaffordable housing, broken healthcare, growing inequality, and pervasive insecurity. That actually fuels these conflicts, not the other stuff. And honestly, I think a lot of people are desperate to turn generations into moral categories because it's simpler than admitting we're all reacting to different stages of the same collapsing social reality.